Chapter 9. Railroads Link Montana to the Nation, 1881 to 1915. The Big Picture. New methods of transportation always change life and society. Railroads changed life in Montana in the 1880s just as much as the coming of the horse did in the 1700s.
See Chapter 3.
Nothing changes people's lives as much as a new kind of transportation. When the whistle of a steam engine first blasted across Montana's skyline, everybody knew that change was on the way. Railroads transformed life here in the 1880s just as the coming of horses did in the 1700s. Trains made travel to Montana fast and affordable. They shipped Montana's resources out to market and brought in farming equipment, consumer goods, and the machines needed to develop the mines. Trains also made travel within Montana much easier. The major railroads opened up the frontier and filled it with new people, towns, farms, and economic activities. Then short lines and branch lines stitched these communities together. By the time all the railroads were built in Montana, the entire nation was linked by rail. The frontier was no more. Life before trains. Imagine being able to travel only 15 miles per day. How different would your life be? In the 1860s, it took 3 to 4 months to travel overland to Montana and 2 months to travel by steamboat. But ice jams, knee-deep mud, snowdrifts, blizzards, and low water on the rivers often brought travel to a halt. Even when all went well, it was hard, slow, and expensive to get to Montana. And you could not transport anything bigger than a wagon could hold. A visit to the next town would be a major expedition. Even on a speedy stagecoach, it took 18 hours to travel the 120 miles from Helena to Virginia City, unless it was rainy or snowy. Then you might have to get out and push. One Helena merchant in 1867 complained that he spent over $4,000, almost $50,000 today, bringing in one shipment of goods, more than he had paid for the goods themselves. When President Abraham Lincoln was assassinated in 1865, it took 2 weeks for Montanans to learn the news. Montana needed railroads to grow. Montana's towns and industries needed railroads to grow. Without them, mine owners could not easily bring in stamp mills and smelter equipment to develop silver and copper mines. Cattle ranchers could not efficiently ship their livestock to outside markets. Trains were the only way to span the great distances from Montana to faraway cities and markets. The nation needed what Montana had, too: gold, silver, copper, wool, and cattle. In the late 1860s, Montana's gold mines produced more than $2 million worth of gold, which is equivalent to $26 million today, every month. Montana paid more federal taxes than any other territory, even more than several states. Connecting Montana to the expanding nationwide rail system would boost the nation's entire economy. Remote,
Far away.
Montana was the last territory in the continental United States to get railroad service. In the 1880s, railroad companies raced one another to get here. 1881, the Utah and Northern. The first railroad to get anywhere near Montana was the Union Pacific. In 1869, the Union Pacific Railroad completed the first transcontinental
All the way across the continent.
railroad. It was part of a railroad network that connected cities in the east to Sacramento, California, passing through Corinne, Utah. This railroad brought Montana's gold fields to within 500 miles of railroad service. Right away, the Union Pacific started building a line north from Utah into Montana, which it later named the Utah and Northern Railway. It ran roughly parallel to the Corinne Road. Construction began in 1872. Slowly, the tracks extended north. But building a railroad in such remote country was expensive. It took 8 years before the tracks even reached the Montana border. Finally, on a bitterly cold December 26, 1881, the first Utah and Northern train entered Butte, capturing the booming mining city's transportation business. Though the Utah and Northern helped Montana's economy tremendously, it served only a few communities. Montana and the nation still looked forward to a transcontinental railroad across the Northern Tier, which is a section of the country. Railroads further reduced Indian lands. To build all the way across Montana, including tracks, train stations, and maintenance sites across the rail lines, railroad companies had to gain control of Indian lands. So the railroads joined with ranchers and political leaders to pressure the government to take big bites out of the Indian reservations.
Land that tribes reserved for their own use through treaties.
Treaties, agreement between governments. With Indian tribes in the 1850s had included permission to build railroads, roads, and telegraph lines across tribal lands. But by the time railroads actually arrived in Montana, circumstances had changed so much that the government had to negotiate new agreements with the tribes. The Crow Reservation loses millions of acres. These were the days of the open-range cattle boom.
See Chapter 8.
Cattle and sheep ranchers, and Montana's political leaders, regularly petitioned Congress to reduce the size of existing reservation lands and open up more acreage for ranches, farms, and settlements. In 1882, the government approved an agreement with the Crow tribe that reduced the Crow Reservation by 1.5 million acres and gave a 400-foot wide right-of-way, which is a legal right to cross someone else's property, to the Northern Pacific Railroad. The Crow signed the agreement because they needed the money the government offered and wanted to demonstrate trust and cooperation. Crow and whites are all one people, Chief Crazyhead told a council gathered to discuss the issue. Bring along the railroad, don't cut timber. A decade later, the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad also gained a right-of-way across Crow land. It also cut timber, ignoring its agreement with the Crow. Over the next 12 years, the government pressured the Crow to give up nearly 3 million more acres from the Crow Reservation. The northern tribes lose the Sweetgrass Hills. Like the Northern Pacific, the Great Northern Railway pressured Congress to gain permission to cross Assiniboine, Gros Ventre, and Blackfeet Reservation lands that stretched across northern Montana territory. Tribal leaders hated the idea of giving up more land, but their people were suffering. The bison were gone, smaller game animals were increasingly hard to find, and miners had destroyed many of the places where their people had traditionally harvested bitterroot, chokecherries, and other important foods. The land they had left was the only wealth they could draw on to benefit their people. In the end, the tribes agreed to the government's proposal to sell 17 million acres of land, including the sacred Sweetgrass Hills region, for $1.5 million, about $32.7 million today. Some of it was paid in houses, tools, farming equipment, and cattle. Much of it the tribes never saw. Reservation agents, who were sometimes dishonest and sometimes just incompetent, lost payments, failed to record them, or simply used them for profit-making projects for themselves and other non-Indians. The 1887 agreement shrank the Blackfeet Reservation, which had stretched across almost 2/3 of eastern Montana, to a small area between the Continental Divide and the headwaters of the Marias River. 1883, the Northern Pacific Railroad. Even while the government was still negotiating for Indian lands, the Northern Pacific Railroad was building westward. Like the Utah and Northern, the Northern Pacific Railroad took a long time to build into Montana. Imagine what an immense job it was to lay tracks from Lake Superior west for almost 2,000 miles across the Northern Plains, the Rocky Mountains, and the Cascade Range, and all the way to the Pacific Ocean. It was one of the largest corporate projects of the 1800s. Land grants. a priceless gift from the government. Railroad construction was enormously expensive. Usually, railroads paid for construction by borrowing from financiers, who were investors who finance huge projects, and by government subsidies. The Northern Pacific had received a charter to build its transcontinental line during the Civil War. Money to build railroads was hard to come by. So instead of money, the government gave the Northern Pacific land grants, which is free land that the federal government gives to a company, an organization, or a state. In all, Congress gave the Northern Pacific 39 million acres of land, an area slightly larger than the state of Georgia, including 13.3 million acres in Montana, which is 14% of all the land in the state. For every mile of main line the company built in Montana, the Northern Pacific was given 40 square miles of land to use, develop, sell, or lease. The Northern Pacific's land grant was the largest land grant in the history of American railroads. By 1900, the railroad was the biggest landowner in Montana. The Northern Pacific drives the last spike. The Northern Pacific met many delays. A nationwide economic crisis called the Panic of 1873 brought the whole nation's economy to a near standstill. It stopped railroad construction completely at Bismarck, Dakota Territory. After the panic ended, construction resumed in 1879. The Northern Pacific rushed to finish building as quickly as possible so it could start making money. From 1882 to 1883, track-laying crews worked feverishly to complete the 900-mile stretch between Glendive, Montana, and Ritzville, Washington. On the western end, thousands of experienced Chinese laborers blasted through rock, built bridges, and laid track through Idaho and along the Clark Fork River in western Montana. They worked through rain, mudslides, snow, fallen timber, steep gorges, and several accidents with explosives. Meanwhile, on the eastern portion, rail gangs of Swedes and Irishmen labored across the plains from Glendive to Garrison. On September 8, 1883, the Northern Pacific held a ceremony at Gold Creek, west of Garrison, to drive the last spike joining the east and west lines. 5 excursion trains, one of them carrying former President Ulysses S. Grant, unloaded hundreds of visitors to celebrate the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad across the northern tier. Now it took just a few days to travel the same distance that the Lewis and Clark expedition had covered in 2 years. 1887, the Great Northern Railway. James J. Hill was a railroad tycoon,
wealthy businessman,
who built the Great Northern Railway. Hill was a scrappy, hot-tempered Canadian whose heroes were men who tried to conquer the world, like Genghis Khan, Napoleon, and Alexander the Great. People called Hill the Empire Builder. James Hill wanted to build an empire that would control transportation and communication from the Mississippi River to the Pacific Ocean. His goal was to undercut the Northern Pacific Railroad by offering lower prices. Hill's Transcontinental Railroad did not receive land grants, as the Northern Pacific did. Instead, he attracted big private investors. These investors included members of the Rockefeller family, which owned Standard Oil, one of the largest corporations in the world. With their support, Hill built the Great Northern Railway, which stretched from Minnesota across North Dakota and Montana and into Washington. The route became known as the High Line because it was the northernmost transcontinental route in the United States. The Great Northern's mad dash for Great Falls. The Great Northern had to stop construction in 1886 to wait for the government's negotiations for Indian lands. The 1887 agreement over the Sweetgrass Hills gave the Great Northern Railway a 75-foot right-of-way over the Rocky Mountains and through western Montana, plus permission to use all the stone and lumber it needed for construction. While the railroad waited, it stockpiled thousands of tons of building materials at Minot, Dakota Territory. Then, in the spring of 1887, Hill's track-laying crew started westward in a terrific rush for Great Falls. They broke many records for high-speed railroad construction. Track-laying gangs set more than 116 miles of rail in the month of August, moving 9.7 million cubic feet of earth, all with horses. They used 100 million board feet, which is a measurement of lumber equal to a board 1 foot long, 1 foot wide, and 1 inch thick, of timber to build bridges and lay railroad ties, enough lumber to build 3,333 houses. And the horses ate 600,000 bushels of oats. The line reached Havre on September 6th, then veered southwest towards Great Falls. Meanwhile, the Montana Central Line, which Hill also partly owned, laid track from Butte through Helena and north to Great Falls to meet the Great Northern. When it was finished, it linked Hill's transcontinental railroad to the mining wealth of Butte. Soon, all of Hill's railroads merged into one company called the Great Northern Railway. The Northern Pacific Railroad had taken Mullen Pass west of Helena. Hill had to find a different way. Rumors circulated about an easy pass over the mountains to the north, but the Blackfeet and Salish tribes did not want railroads cutting through their hunting grounds. They protected its location for a long time. In 1889, after the bison were gone, an Indian guide took a Great Northern engineer named John F. Stevens into the mountains and showed him the pass. Now called Marias Pass, it is located just south of Glacier National Park. At 5,213 feet in elevation, it proved to be the easiest of all passes used by the railroads to cross the Rockies. Because it was so hard for the railroads to find, Marias Pass was often called Lost Pass, but it was never lost to the Indian people. Once over the Rockies, the Great Northern dipped south to present-day Kalispell, then pushed across mountainous northwestern Montana and across the Cascade Range, reaching Seattle in July 1893. 1907. The Chicago, Milwaukee, St. Paul, and Pacific Railroad. In 1907, a third transcontinental railroad arrived, the Chicago, Milwaukee, St. Paul, and Pacific Railroad, which most people called the Milwaukee Road. It was Montana's only 20th century transcontinental railroad. It was known for its sleek style and modern engineering. While most passenger cars were black or dark green, the Milwaukee's trains were a flashy orange and maroon. Other transcontinentals laid track across the frontier, but the Milwaukee built through a settled landscape. It erected standardized station buildings with a recognizable style. Instead of wooden trestles, it built more modern-looking steel bridges anchored in concrete. It erected standardized station buildings with a recognizable style. Instead of wooden trestles, it built more modern-looking steel bridges anchored in concrete. The Milwaukee Road entered southeast Montana in 1907 and cut through eastern Montana to reach towns not served by the Northern Pacific. Then it crossed the Northern Pacific tracks at Terry and angled north through the agriculturally rich Musselshell Valley. It crossed the Rockies through a 2,200-foot tunnel at Pipestone Pass, then eased down into Butte along the Butte, Anaconda, and Pacific Railway tracks. From there, it paralleled the Northern Pacific along the old Mullen Road into Idaho and west to the coast. The Milwaukee Road's route to the Pacific allowed the company to gain a share of the profitable freight business of the Anaconda Copper Mining Company, which owned mines in Butte and a smelter in Anaconda. But it also brought railroad access into sparsely populated areas of eastern Montana. To increase business there, the Milwaukee Corporation aggressively marketed homesteading land in eastern Montana. Like the other railroads, the Milwaukee advertised eastern Montana as a farmer's paradise.
See Chapter 13.
Perhaps the most memorable aspect of the Milwaukee Road was its electrified line. In the 1910s, the railroad electrified the portion of its line from Harlowtown to Avery, Idaho, so that electric motors could pull trains over the steep grades instead of the standard steam engines. These electrified rails came partly because of John D. Ryan. Ryan was president of the Anaconda Copper Mining Company and sat on the board of directors of the Milwaukee Road. In 1912, Ryan bought up several small power companies and formed the Montana Power Company. It began supplying electricity to the copper giants' mines and smelters. Then he arranged for the Milwaukee Road to switch from steam power to electric power and to become a major customer of Montana Power as well. The Montana Power Company gained enormous economic and political clout
Influence
in the region. With control of both Anaconda Copper and Montana Power, John D. Ryan became the most powerful man in Montana and a major figure in the nation's industrial history. The men who built the railroads. Railroad construction depended on young, single, immigrant men who were willing to live in traveling bunkhouses or tent camps that moved as the tracks progressed. The work was hard, and the living conditions were poor. Railroad companies usually did not provide heat, good food, or clean water. The workers could bathe only when the railroad route took them close to a river. Both the Northern Pacific and the Great Northern Railway hired Asian immigrants to help build their railroads. The Northern Pacific used several thousand Chinese laborers. These experienced railroad workers performed extremely difficult and dangerous work, like planting dynamite in cliffs to blast out rock. Sometimes workers fell from the rope ladders they used to descend the steep cliffs. Sometimes dynamite exploded at the wrong time. The Great Northern Railway hired several thousand Japanese section hands to maintain its line. They, too, took back-breaking jobs and usually received lower pay than white workers, just 90 cents to the whites' $1.45,
now worth $21 to $35
per 10-hour day. One Japanese railroad laborer later wrote, "Life in the rail gangs was almost unbelievably hard, and the meals were barely enough to support life. With not a single holiday, even once a month, they worked all in a sweat to earn money." Later, Japanese workers advanced to higher-paying jobs, and many settled here. By about 1900, there were 2,400 Japanese spread across Montana in towns like Missoula, Whitefish, Belt, and Wolf Point. Asians often faced racism and discrimination. White workers accused Chinese and Japanese laborers of stealing jobs from them because they would work for lower wages. But most labor unions, which are organizations of employees that bargain with employers, refused to let Asian laborers join or to help them organize for higher pay. Some communities did welcome Japanese workers and their families. In the great northern town of Whitefish, a woman named Elizabeth Peck taught English to more than 400 Japanese residents and fondly remembered their friendship. In 1921, she asked the Japanese community to donate money to help build a new building for her church. To her surprise, the Japanese families of Whitefish bought 2 windows worth $750, which came with a plaque reading, "For Mrs. Elizabeth D. Peck from the Japanese." The railroads also hired immigrants from many European countries, especially Sweden, Norway, Italy, and Bulgaria. These immigrants spread out across Montana, where they kept the track and equipment in good repair. They also worked in railroad yards, assembling long lines of cars into trains. The work could be dangerous, especially in busy yards, where the threat of losing a hand or of being run over was ever present. In 1911, railroads employed nearly 23,000 Montanans. By about 1920, Montana had one of the highest proportions of railroad workers of any state. These railroad employees joined labor unions, and the unions negotiated with the railroads for higher pay and safer working conditions. With the unions' help, railroad work went from being dangerous and poorly paid in the 1800s to being highly regulated and well-paid in the 1900s. Communities where large numbers of railroad workers lived, like Forsyth, Havre, and Harlowton, thrived as railroaders spent their paychecks at local businesses. Railroad workers' income was especially important to these towns when the homestead boom went bust.
See Chapter 13.
Railroads crisscrossed the land. As Montana's population grew, more railroad companies built lines to places the Northern Pacific and Great Northern Railroads did not serve. Soon, one of the nation's most successful railroads pushed a line westward into Billings from the south. This was the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad, called the Burlington. The Burlington completed a line from Omaha to Billings in 1894, and later added another line from Billings to Denver. Independent short-line railroads and branch lines of the major companies soon filled in the gaps between the major routes. Some were very short, like the 20-mile Montana Western, which ran from Conrad to Valier, the 25-mile Montana, Wyoming, and Southern, Bridger to Bear Creek, and the Big Blackfoot Railway, which extended 11 miles east from Bonner. By about 1910, nearly 4,300 miles of railroad tracks stitched across Montana. Mainline, branch line, and short line railroads stretched to all of the state's industrial regions. They were like the veins and arteries of Montana. They pumped food, supplies, fuel, and equipment into the towns and the mining and logging centers, and they carried products out. Most towns or businesses off the railroad grid stayed small. They were served only by horse, wagon, steamboat, or stagecoach. By 1920, you could ride a train to most small towns in Montana. The tiny remote mining town of Elkhorn in Jefferson County welcomed 3 trains a day. In the 98 miles between Opheim and Bainville, in far northeastern Montana, there were more than 15 stops. In the 98 miles between Opheim and Bainville, in far northeastern Montana, there were more than 15 stops. Railroads changed everyday life. The coming of the railroads changed life in the late 1800s even more than the internet did in the early 2000s. They connected towns and people together much more easily. People could order new farm equipment, furniture, and musical instruments from mail-order catalogs and have them shipped in by train. They could also learn about and order the latest fashions. Trains carried in new, mass-produced gadgets, machines, and technologies like washing machines, telephones, and automobiles. Conveniences like the Wringer washing machine made life on the plains much easier. Trains changed many things about life in Montana, even things as basic as the type of houses people lived in and the food they ate. Communities without their own sawmills could import milled lumber, plate glass windows, and architectural ornaments like embossed,
pressed with a design,
tin ceilings. Cabins built from local materials were no longer the only kind of housing available. You could order an entire house from the Sears and Roebuck or Montgomery Ward catalog and have the pieces shipped out by train. Trains had refrigerator cars that carried fresh fruit, vegetables, and seafood into Montana from other places. Stores could carry a wider variety of foods, everything from oranges to oysters, instead of just canned goods and locally grown produce. Fancy restaurants opened in Butte, Helena, Billings, and Great Falls, offering foods from far away. The trains themselves also offered sophisticated menus, featuring delicacies like green sea turtle soup, lobster, English plum pudding, and strawberry Bavarian cream. Trains brought people together more. Trains became an important part of Montana's social life. Groups like the Shriners and Boy Scouts chartered
reserved
special trains for their meetings. Others chartered trains to get to sports events, fairs, or ceremonial gatherings. politicians rode across the countryside giving speeches from trains. Sometimes, the railroads gave free passage to special chapel cars. People who did not live near churches, or who were out working in a railroad construction camp, could gather for church at these movable chapels. Trains brought first-class entertainers of all kinds to Montana's big cities. Butte was one of the main railroad stops between Minneapolis and Seattle, so many touring opera, theater, and musical shows played there. Renowned actress Lillian Russell said that Butte reminded me of some of Chicago's busiest streets, and I shall never forget it. Lesser-known performers also rode the rails, bringing live theater and vaudeville acts to towns along the tracks. The short lines and smaller railroads, which connected smaller towns, sometimes served as school buses. Kids would dash for the train as it made its regular stops along its route. As one engineer remembered, if someone were missing at a stop, we could usually find him coming across a field or popping out of a house. We knew where they lived and would whistle to tell them we were coming or waiting for them. Railroads also improved communication. A telegraph, which is an electric message system that transmitted coded signals along a wire, conveyed messages over great distances almost immediately. Telegraph lines followed the tracks. Each station had its own telegrapher, who conducted railroad business, but also relayed breaking news, making the station an important community gathering place. Sometimes, people played chess with someone in a neighboring town via telegraph. In Whitehall, railroad telegrapher Pat Huntley recorded the progress of World Series baseball games as they came across the wire. His son Chet later wrote, "A cluster of people would gather in the waiting room of the station, and I would bellow through the ticket window the play-by-play action of the game." Chet Huntley grew up to become one of the nation's most famous television newscasters. Railroads transformed the landscape. As they built across Montana, the Northern Pacific, Great Northern, and Milwaukee Road created towns, placed streets, and sold lots. They needed to earn back the high cost of construction and to build businesses for themselves. Many towns like Forsyth, Livingston, Harlowton, Glasgow, Havre, and Lima were originally created by the railroads as bases for maintenance and operations. As the railroads sold land, these maintenance centers blossomed into towns.
See Chapter 14.
Railroads also worked hard to fill the land with people. As the Milwaukee Road built across sparsely populated eastern Montana, it began aggressively marketing Montana as a great place to homestead.
See Chapter 15.
Soon, the Northern Pacific and the Great Northern joined in. Railroad companies became the biggest marketers of Montana to the world. In response, people flooded in by the thousands. Between 1880 and 1900, Montana's population increased from 39,000 to 243,000 people. 2 new national parks. The railroads also advertised Montana as a great place to visit by train. They built upscale hotels in a few remote and beautiful areas to attract wealthy tourists. Many of these hotels had indoor toilets, fancy dining rooms, and even electric lights, long before the average Montanan had electricity. The Northern Pacific Railroad even helped create Yellowstone National Park. In the early 1870s, railroad officials lobbied Congress to set aside a large tract of land in Wyoming and Montana as a public pleasuring ground. Congress created Yellowstone National Park in 1872. It was the first time that any national government had set aside public lands for a national park. The Great Northern Railway promoted the splendors of Montana's Northwest Mountains. Great Northern executives encouraged Congress to set aside the beautiful Rocky Mountain area, known to Blackfeet as the backbone of the world, as a preserve. The railroad built a series of hotels and Swiss-style backcountry chalets to promote tourism on their railroad. In 1895, the government pressured Blackfeet chief White Calf to sell 800,000 acres of this land. In 1910, it became part of Glacier National Park. Railroads fueled an industrial boom. The biggest change the railroads brought was to Montana's industries. Railroads brought in the machinery and equipment that industrialized Montana.
Developed its industries on a large scale.
Mining companies shipped in huge, heavy equipment for hard rock mines and smelters. Silver and copper mining expanded quickly. Sawmills imported large-scale equipment, then transported millions of timbers to the underground silver and copper mines, and for use by the railroads themselves. And the railroads shipped silver ore,
rock containing precious metals, in this case silver,
refined copper, cattle, sheep, and wool eastward to market. A boom for silver and copper. By 1883, the year the Northern Pacific completed its line across Montana, the territory had become the second largest producer of silver in the nation. By 1889, 25% of the silver mined in the United States came from Montana. For the next few years, Montana produced $20 million a year, which is equal to about $403 million today in silver. Montana's copper smelting industry began at the same time that electricity and telephones spread around the world. Copper conducts heat, electric current, and voice transmission very efficiently. Copper went into electric and telephone wire, copper coils, copper tubing, and thousands of other needs of the industrialized world. This could not have happened without the railroads. By 1900, Butte and Anaconda were producing 61% of the copper in the United States and 23% of the copper in the world. The copper from Butte and Anaconda was so important to the Industrial Revolution that some historians say the Butte-Anaconda region helped transform the United States into a modern superpower. Coal to fuel the railroads. The railroads also began mining coal to fuel their engines. The Northern Pacific Railroad developed coal mines east of Bozeman, near Red Lodge, and later at Coal Strip, which became its most productive mine. The Great Northern Railway mined coal from a large deposit in Cascade County, near the communities of Stockett and Sand Coulee. The Milwaukee Road mined coal near Roundup. Montana's phenomenal coal reserves offered enough for all. Railroad owners gained power over Montana. Railroad owners invested in mining, refining,
separating precious metal from rock,
and lumber industries. They wanted these industries to grow so they could profit from them and from the freight traffic they would generate. Soon, a small group of corporate owners and financiers, including John D. Ryan, William A. Clark, Marcus Daly, and James J. Hill, gained tremendous political and economic power in Montana. They exercised that power to shape laws, regulations, and transportation rates in ways that benefited their corporations. The Northern Pacific Railroad, through its land grants, controlled vast swaths
areas
of Montana land. As the railroad claimed sections of land, it made some enemies among the people who worked farms or mines nearby. Great Falls farmer W.R. Selous wrote in an 1888 letter that he was out cutting grain for neighboring farms when the Great Northern came through his farm and laid railroad tracks 50 feet from his house. So close, it shakes the house when they go by, he said. Some Montanans resented the political and economic power that railroads gained. Farmers in eastern Montana complained that they paid outrageously high transportation rates while the mines enjoyed special treatment. This resentment created many conflicts in the territorial legislature,
the branch of government that passes laws,
pitting agricultural counties against the more powerful industrial counties. Some people even came to see train robbers as modern-day Robin Hoods. On the doorstep of statehood. By 1889, Montana's raw materials were streaming to eastern markets, its population was booming, and a string of new settlements had been established throughout its frontier lands. After 25 difficult years as a territory, Montana was ready to become a state.
How it worked. Signals in the railroad yard. Crews in the railroad yards coupled and uncoupled cars, switched cars from one engine to another, tested air brakes, and sometimes helped unload freight and baggage. Any work done near a moving train car was a dangerous operation, and the locomotive engineer had to know exactly when to start the train forward, stop, or go backward in the yard. Before radios, the workers in the yard communicated with the locomotive engineer using a system of signals. There was a different signal for each movement of the train. Raising your hand straight up and lowering it again meant go forward. Swinging your hand in a vertical circle backward meant back up. Holding your hand out at arm's length meant slow down, and swinging your arm or a lantern across the track meant stop. To test the brakes, a brakeman swung his hands horizontally above his head to signal apply air brakes, then held his hand at arm's length above his head to signal release air brakes. The locomotive engineer used whistle signals to respond to the brakeman's hand signals or to let the crew know whenever the engine was going to move. Whistle signals combined short and long toots. You probably have heard the most common one, two long sounds, a short and a long, toot, toot, tut, toot, which means train approaching public grade crossing. Other whistle signals sent messages specifically to the brakeman. 2 short toots meant got your signal. 3 short toots meant backing up. 4 short toots meant please repeat your signal. 1 short and 3 longs sent a flagman down the tracks to protect the rear of the train and to signal any oncoming train to stop. 3 longs and a short sent one out to protect the front of the train. 4 or 5 long toots called the flagman back, and a series of short blasts meant emergency. Today, brakemen and engineers have cell phones to communicate about emergencies or any complicated maneuvers, but you are still likely to hear whistle signals in the train yard and at public crossings. And if you ride the train today, you'll most likely hear the same "all aboard" that railroad conductors have said for more than 150 years, followed by a raised and lowered arm that signals to the engineer, go forward.